Hello all and welcome, and I'm the MGTOW philosopher. And in this video, I would like to discuss the subject of white privilege. Now, this white privilege bullshit really annoys me. I'm white, and I don't know how exactly I'm privileged in any way. I mean, is being called a rapist just because I'm white a privilege? Is being told I'm evil and an oppressor of my fellow man some kind of privilege? Is being told that I received some kind of leg up that other people didn't get, some kind of privilege? I mean, hell, my parents were far from special as people go, and they gave me nothing, not a damn thing. Everything I have, I worked for. White people, we're in no way recipients of illicit white privilege. Illicit meaning immoral, evil, or undeserved. Now, the funny thing is that A, we don't receive any privilege, and B, maybe we should. After all, up until 1965, America was 90% white. White Europeans built this country, for God's sake. And in fact, all the countries that the so-called oppressed people want to go to and live in are countries built by white people. Now, first, let me ask you this. Why are these people the oppressed and not the oppressors? After all, blacks invented black slavery. Hell, they took their own people as slaves and sold them into slavery to white people. But you don't hear the left talk about that. And that's because this is not a convenient truth. It's not convenient to their narrative. Because what the left really wants to do is vilify whites by first identifying them as oppressive and colonial in nature. And secondly, they want to brand us as evil. You know, it's amusing how the left says that race is nothing more than a social construct, yet they then ascribe certain characteristics to specific races, which totally goes against their social construct theory. Of course, the left would say that the evil of whites is simply something that they learned. That's why you see so many whites running around virtue signaling and telling other whites to check their privilege and virtue signaling that they're one of the good whites, someone who has recognized and checked their privilege. Meanwhile, everyone discriminates against us, badmouths whites, but we somehow have privilege? Really? Where's the privilege? I don't see it. Blacks have affirmative action. They get 260 points added to their SAT scores when they apply to go to college. They're preferred as job candidates, as a so-called oppressed class, along with women and other minorities. Men are less likely to go to university than women, 35% to 65% for women. Men are called evil. White men are called evil. White men are called racist for being white, which is actual racism. Men actually get less opportunities because they are seen as having too much privilege. So others, who are perhaps less deserving individuals, receive a benefit instead of them. And if a white person does need help, there are all sorts of social programs in place to show preferential treatment to everyone else except him. But this is only for white males, of course, as women are somehow an oppressed class, even though they get more education and are more likely to get the jobs they want and make more money if they have the same educational background and years of experience as a man. And they don't have to register for the draft and risk being sent to war and blown up. So where exactly is the privilege that we white men are supposed to be recipients of? Sounds like everyone else except us is getting it. Is it because, by and large, we are more successful overall than blacks and Latinos? Could that be why we're seen as having some kind of privilege that they don't supposedly get? If that's the case, then why not recognize Asian privilege as well? Asians, on average, do better than whites, even though they were a smaller minority in America than both blacks and Hispanics. They make more money than whites, do better in university, and succeed at rates well above white people. How can this be? Asian privilege? Now, leftists would have you believe that people who do better as a group than other groups are simply recipients of some kind of immoral privilege. For example, because whites had some kind of supposed head start in the past by getting to own slaves, By the way, less than 5% of people in the U.S. actually own slaves. And being the folks that built and ran the country, that we have somehow built into the system biases, preferences, and tools that favor whites. But if that's the case, where are these tools? These biases, these racist institutions within our government that favor whites and are supposed to help us and disfavor blacks, Asians, and minorities. I mean, if this were the case, wouldn't Asians be doing the worst of all? After all, they were as hated or more hated than blacks. They were seen as outsiders, where at least the black man was born and grew up in the USA. They were hated because they worked harder on average than whites and at a lower wage, something that might account for why they often do better than whites in America today. They were hated because they were so very different from us. As we all know, we hate what we cannot understand. They were not even allowed to give testimony in certain parts of the U.S. in a court of law in the 19th century against white people. They were derisively called celestials, both for the fact that they called their country the Celestial Empire and because they were seen as very alien and strange, as if from somewhere far away, which they were. Instances of institutional racism and bias against non-whites was clear and obvious at this time in the past. Chinese were excluded from most parts of society, unless manual labor was needed, of course. Otherwise, they were treated very poorly. Now, it's the exact opposite. Of course, the left says such institutional racism exists now in the present, both to disenfranchise minorities and to enfranchise whites. But they can't pinpoint it. And they're reduced to talking about things like subconscious bias, something so nebulous and impossible to pinpoint that I would challenge that it even exists. Certainly it doesn't exist on any large scale in the United States today. Otherwise, someone could point a finger at it and say, that institution is racist, or say, look, that place is racist. But nobody can do that. Yet this narrative is still told, even though the very people who should be suffering the most, Asians, are doing the best in terms of education and income. How can that be if this institutional racism still exists and is a holdover from the past? A past in which Chinese were discriminated against as much, or perhaps even more, if that's possible, than black people. Where's the disadvantage that they should be receiving in society as a whole, as a group? After all, they received no head start, as it were. Far from it. So how are they doing so well when blacks are doing so badly? How are they doing better than white people? How are they doing better than Latinos? After all, Latinos came from another place and immigrated here to America, and they were not slaves of whites, yet they don't do nearly as well as Asians, who number far fewer than them. Even more interesting is this. How are they doing better than we are? The privileged white male in our own country, where we're supposed to be the beneficiaries of this so-called white male privilege. Of course, the answer is obvious, and is the same answer which tells you why the left never ever talks about Asians. Because there is no white male privilege. No white privilege of any kind. And acknowledging the inconvenient blip of Asian success would disprove the left's entire narrative. Because if white privilege were a real thing, whites would be doing the best in America, not Asians. That's why if you bring this up to a leftist, they look like a deer in the headlights. And once they regain their senses, they will then scold you and say something like, Asian privilege? That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Get the hell out of here. Asian privilege? That just isn't part of their indoctrination campaign. And since it falls outside the parameters of said indoctrination, they won't know or want to know anything about it. They can't. Such knowledge would require one to diverge from their narrative, and they just can't do that. Because that would require them to think for themselves and question their own faith. For you see, leftism is more religion than anything else. They simply cannot entertain the possibility that it might all be a big fat lie that they've devoted their entire lives to. But to be honest, they never even get to the point where they think these kind of thoughts. The left has more built-in ideological safeguards than even religion does. And so re-educating these people is almost impossible. Hence, no matter what you say, no matter how logical your arguments, whites are doing well because of institutional racism that holds back minorities. Except Asians, of course, who, even though they were historically one of the most hated minorities in America and are still one of the smallest, are doing better than white people. Yeah. Of course, that shouldn't be true. It should stand to reason that they would be doing the worst. But as the left would say, never let an inconvenient fact get in the way of your narrative. Of course, with the left, feelings are facts are not facts, except for the facts they have been taught are true, which are facts, of course. And anything else that contradicts those facts is not a fact, but just someone's opinion, because there are no real facts, just opinions, as everything is open to interpretation, except their facts, of course, which are actual facts and not open to interpretation. Did you follow that? This view of every other viewpoint that isn't that which they have been taught is true, as being open to interpretation, is one of the hallmarks of the left, and is just one of the built-in mechanisms, safeguards that I talked about earlier that keep them from thinking for themselves and seeing the truth of reality. Hence, they stay firmly entrenched within their own ideology, and they only see that which they have been taught as being true, and every other faith as a lie. It's essentially dogma, and it's no different whatsoever from religion. Hence, you can ask a leftist until you're blue in the face how white privilege exists if whites are not benefiting. And they will say we are benefiting, either from unconscious bias, from those who are within the system and who are whites giving privilege to other whites who go through the system, or from institutional bias that exists to favor whites and not blacks or minorities, even though Asians do better than everyone, and there's no Asian privilege to explain this phenomenon. Okay. Of course, the obvious answer to me is that Asians do better because traditionally they are among the hardest working people in the world, as well as possessing some of the highest average IQs in the world, which ties directly into earnings. But that is somehow a radical view, meaning an actual fact, one that is not put forth by either the media or the education system. Hence, this conclusion, which is rather obvious to me, goes totally unnoticed by the leftist, who isn't doing any thinking at all anyway, and it is just spouting what are essentially prepared talking points he learned from his leftist professor. Now, being hardworking and having a higher IQ on average, now that flies in the face of the left's belief that race is just a social construct and takes all footing away from their narrative that whites are evil and do well because they're racist to discriminate against others and take all the goodies for themselves because we don't even do the best in our own country. We do well, of course, but we don't do the best. However, we are still the largest sector of the population. We still hold the majority of seats in government, education, and media. That being the case, we do as a race still run things in the eye of the collectivist left, who only recognizes groups and not individuals. That being the case, who do you have to disenfranchise before you can take over? Why, white people, of course. That's why the leftists could care less about Asians doing well. They're not in charge. This white privilege bullshit is just a narrative to make people hate whites so as to put more minorities and women into power, people who they can control and who believe this corrosive ideology. Then they can bring about the so-called workers' revolution and the communist utopia on earth. I know, it's a bit of a disappointing crescendo, isn't it? All this nonsense from the left about a bullshit narrative that is so obviously false and so easily disproved just to put a bad ideology behind the wheel. I know, it's a disappointing climax, but that's it. Whites are demonized, white males that is, because they're seen as possessing most of the power and influence in society. Convince enough people that whites are inherently evil, including whites themselves, and make whites hate themselves and actually work against their own best interests out of white guilt, and you can fundamentally transform the country. Where have we heard that before? You can fundamentally transform it, all right, but not in a good way. Consequently, notice that white women are excluded from the evil white people equation. That's because they're seen as an oppressed class, even though they're the most privileged people in the entire world, and on earth for that matter. In the world, on earth, same thing. As I've said before, feminism, it's nothing more than a Trojan horse. It's set in place to destabilize America right at its heart. And the goal of the left is nothing more than to place into power the dumbest races on earth. Blacks, Mexicans, people from the Middle East, your typical Muslim, all of whom have average IQs ranging from the low 70s up to around 90 on average for American-born blacks whose ancestors came from America. And let us not forget women who are highly emotional, collectivist in nature, and who are easily manipulated by leftist propaganda. All facts, and all facts that might explain why these groups, by and large, do so poorly, minus white women, of course. And not some kind of mystery phantom privilege that white people have that's keeping them down. Now, these are scary thoughts at first. And first, they have to be realized before one can be frightened. As we all know, the left hates success and envies the successful and wants nothing more than to pull down successful people. They see whites, who make up the majority of the population, as so-called oppressors, as is always the case with Marxism. And therefore, they're doing well, meaning white people, because of some kind of immoral advantage that they have received. Now, that's the narrative of the left, at least. And no amount of logic that it's obviously false will change their minds. After all, it must be true, right? We built America, so why would it be designed to favor us? Why would it not be designed to favor us, I mean? A thought only a leftist could have, of course. I mean, honestly, America has not been like that for almost 60 years. And the fact that the smallest minority in America, one of the smallest minorities in America, beats our ass in every way, proves this narrative to be a total lie in today's modern world. Asians are kicking white people's asses in every way. From education to income, they kill us. But don't tell that to a leftist who is living a lie so as to explain to themselves why they're not more successful. Or a successful leftist who believes it because, well, that's what he was taught, and how his virtue, white guilt, and identity are all tied up in these beliefs, which have become part of his ego and how he identifies himself. People, white privilege is a myth. It's a scapegoat narrative designed to disenfranchise the white people and give power to the so-called oppressed so as to make society serve those who are supposedly most important in the eyes of the left. That being the oppressed themselves. The workers, the artists, the so-called creative people. All it is a nasty, evil, divisive ideology, and it is threatening to destroy the world. Why? Because it splits the world into two groups, successful and unsuccessful. It justifies tearing down the successful and giving their ill-gotten gains, so say the left, that they're ill-gotten, to the unsuccessful. It's an easy answer for those who lack success in regards to why they lack it. And is such an attractive ideology because it gives free shit to those who haven't earned it and allows the unsuccessful to tear down those that they envy. Sadly, what they don't grasp is that those who are most successful got that way, at least by and large, not by stealing from anyone else, but by being smarter and harder working than everyone else. And their success created the very jobs and products and services that sustain society, meaning the so-called oppressed people. Now, if you turn around and you de-incentivize these people and remove them from the equation, and all of the so-called oppressed people get what they want, well, those oppressed people will die, as they'll have no jobs to work, and no one to create the massive amounts of surplus that the so-called successful people do. no successful people to create this massive surplus value for the so-called oppressed people to leech off of. In the end, it isn't the worker that's the foundation of society. It's those few geniuses who exist, who create all the jobs that the so-called oppressed people get. And then they complain about how the CEO who created the very job that they are benefiting from, they turn around and complain about how much he makes a year. Absurd. White privilege is nothing more than the fact that whites as a race happen to have a much higher IQ on average than blacks or Mexicans. And Asian privilege is nothing more than the fact that Asians just happen to have an average higher IQ than whites, 2 or 3 points, by the way. And Jewish privilege is nothing more than the fact that Jews, on average, have a average IQ 10 to 15 points higher than your average white person, meaning around 110 to 115. Yes, I know, that explains a lot. But we don't hear about Jewish privilege. We also don't hear about Jews being oppressed. Why? Well, because they do well, wherever they go. So the left can't use them as an example of an oppressed class. Intelligence, this is the only white privilege that white people have. That, and maybe our culture, which is also superior to that of so-called oppressed classes. So, a relatively high intelligence in regards to most other races, except for Asians and Jews, of course, who do better than us. And that's it. That's the only privilege that we have. Higher intelligence and superior culture. I am the MGTOW philosopher, and I wish you a good day. Take care.